What I am hoping that we can do, let me see. What I'm hoping that we can do is I'm hoping that we can get some dialogue between the two concurrent sessions. You know, certainly we did split you up, and we talked about disaster-resilient communities through public-private partnerships, and we talked about hazard mitigation planning, and I think some of you may have struggled with which one to go to, or may have hopped between a bit. I know they were both very interesting to me, and I think they're both very connected, because I feel that mitigation planning can be another tool, another path on the road to building a more disaster-resilient community. And so I'm hoping that we can talk not just about what came out of the sessions, but also cross them and come back together to the broader topic at hand. What I'm going to ask is I'm going to ask both of our concurrent session leads, starting with Darren, to take just a few minutes to summarize the highlights of their session, and then what I'm thinking is we really just open it up to you, and let's have a discussion together.
Okay, thanks, Alessandra. And this is a challenge because we had a lengthy, a lot of overlapping, a lot of the tangential discussions over the course of the day. I think that some of our presentations maybe went a little bit longer, but we were getting some really good information or provocative statements and what have you to sort of add fuel to the fire for the discussions later. So in terms of a whole, what I was really hoping for was sort of a short list of some key recommendations or action items, at least from NHMA's Hazard Mitigation Planning Committee, that could be tied back to some of our goals. Rather than really a set framework or list of recommendations, what I'm going to do is hit on at least a couple of the, I think, topic areas or themes. Some of these are questions which are directions we think NHMA as an association can go more towards further considering and tying into more specific action items, if that makes sense. But it was tough. We ran out of time, is the bottom line. We really did. But there was discussions that were important to have. Number one of the issues we talked about after hearing particularly from Karen and Karen Helbrecht with FEMA and Gavin Smith and his study at UNC on the evaluation of local mitigation plans is begging the question: is the current national unilateral approach to mitigation planning in terms of a standardized process and review for developing the plans and reviewing those plans, is that the right way to go? As Ken Topping had alluded to during one of the workshop plenaries on Sunday, or I guess it was a breakout session, but he had said, the first 10 years after following the Disaster Mitigation Act, we've done a real good job in terms of quantity. We've got a large majority of the population covered, a lot of communities covered under FEMA-approved hazard mitigation plans, but we now need to start focusing a little bit more on that question of quality. And Gavin's presentation was on that, but the real question becomes, in terms of the resources and the time and effort that FEMA and the states are spending in working with these local communities and developing these local hazard mitigation plans, do we want to maybe channel that in a different direction? And should that maybe become more of a risk-based approach or an approach that recognizes a local commitment to a mitigation ethic, I like to call it, or those communities that will meet you halfway there as opposed to seeking just to get their ticket punched for grant funding. So again, that was one more of the question is, do we need to start focusing maybe on a certain segment of communities as opposed to a nationwide unilateral approach? We talked about incentives, both carrots and sticks. We talked about the public assistance program as a disaster relief program. Are there ways, and this would be certainly something more long-term, but in terms of maybe the more of a stick approach, looking at the cost share requirements for that, or limiting public assistance to communities that have approved hazard mitigation plans. In terms, and again, tying that back to quality or some performance measures. Jim Schwab from the American Planning Association, I stole him from the researchers meeting, and he talked to us about integration with other local planning initiatives. I think we needed to spend a little bit more time on that. One thing that we learned from Ron Flanagan in his presentation, though, was certainly tying. What needs to happen is these local mitigation plans should definitely be tied more into the local capital improvements programming, and Karen talked about the local budget cycles and those kinds of things. So we have that sort of as another topic area we want to focus a little bit more on, because that's not something that's talked about or seen too often in some of the guidance. One big issue, and this was the theme, I think, probably perhaps in Tim's session without even talking to him, but is how do local governments today in this economy do more with less? If we're asking them to do that much more in terms of planning or whatever it may be, do with less in terms of time, resources, and then, of course, that leads to perhaps a less of a priority on hazards management. We need to look at capacity building. We need to look at, well, a big discussion item that dominated our afternoon was multi-jurisdictional mitigation planning versus standalone and single jurisdiction planning. And what are the benefits and what are the weaknesses of that type of planning process? And it was a pretty healthy debate. And I'm not going to get too far down the road into that, but it basically came down to, well, it's really meant to be a community-based planning process. And Lou Dooley here from Washington, Local Emergency Management Coordinator, kind of gave us their take and said we developed sort of a hybrid approach. And we had, I'm not going to ask you, calling you, Lou, to give more details about that, but the key answer to the question was it really should be up to the local communities. And there are definitely benefits to larger multi-jurisdictional plans, but certainly a lot of benefits to focusing on a standalone mitigation plan. Education was a huge component, training and education. And that's for one item that we had talked about is there is a webinar. FEMA has some webinars that are being planned for multi-hazard mitigation planning. French Wetmore talked about the community rating system and webinar that is coming together for floodplain management planning and the new schedule of activities under that. And one, I think, thing that we've identified as a must, short-term action item is to do a joint, integrated webinar with multi-hazard planning and CRS. All right. There's a whole lot. One thing that came up was climate change adaptation, not being within the Code of Federal Regulations for local mitigation planning, not necessarily being touched on by FEMA in their planning guidance, but there are best practices around the country that can be pointed to, and that was a significant issue raised by Gavin in his presentation. What is missing in terms of whether it's the guidance or even looking at regulatory changes in the future that NHMA perhaps can start to develop recommendations towards. Climate change adaptation was a significant topic. The state's role in local mitigation planning was something that came up again and again. I'm not going to get too into some of the specifics of what we came up with there. Let's see. Okay, I think I'm just going to wrap up with one of the actions I think that we did identify as necessary, because we, again, going back to the quality, talking about local mitigation plan quality, we need to focus on there are local mitigation plans that are out there. So I thought that was another good idea. And Ron, I don't know if I captured everything. As my co-chair for Hazard Mitigation Planning Committee, I just wanted to ask you if I missed anything in that really quick summary of 7 hours of discussion.
The only other issue that I think we ought to give some thought to is FEMA and the flood management folks have developed the CRS program that has come up over the last 20 years with some kind of evaluation criteria to determine what kinds of plans deserve credit and attention. And they have been able to put numerical numbers to things like public involvement and participation, etc. I have to think that if we really give it some serious thought, we ought to be able to come up with some moral equivalent to that kind of a rating program where we can, find out what plans are really doing a good job and which ones are just meeting minimum criteria. And then the next challenge would be what would be the incentives then for a community, in CRS, they get insurance discounts. In HMGP, what? And those are some things I think that we as a profession need to give some thought to.
Thank you, Ron. And I know we had some note takers who probably had a real hard time keeping up with the discussion. If any of you are here, is there anything I missed that would be a key point of discussion to share with the good of the order? Okay. No, Sandra, I think that's the real brief summary as best I can do.
Maybe say it, please.
Okay.
Tim, you can do the same.
We had a very exciting session on disaster resilient communities. Let me give you an overview of the agenda as it was supposed to be, and then tell you what actually happened. It was all good. The first presenter was Bill Hook, who actually talked about public-private partnerships and how research applies to that. He, of course, was the chair of a committee that came up with a report on public-private partnerships as it applies to disaster-resilient communities. Our second moderator, who actually came up fairly quickly. In fact, I had left the room and came back, and Bill was already done, and the second person was already up. Warren Edwards with Oak Ridge National Labs, who administers the CARI program. And I'm sorry, somebody help me out here. What does CARI stand for?
Community and Regional Resilience Institute.
Thank you. And so he talked about the work of CARI, the research they have done on resilience, and the tool that they have come up with to assist communities on becoming disaster resilient. There was additional discussion as a part of that about other models of resilience, other research that might apply to that. Frankly, that discussion did not happen this morning, but there was some additional discussion this afternoon where several other research projects and models came up that we did capture in our notes. One thing that came out of the discussion with Warren Edwards was this question about certifying communities. Is there a value in having one system for certifying communities as disaster resilient? There seemed to be a general consensus in the room, and those that participated in the discussion, please correct me if I'm wrong, that certification with one model is not necessarily best, that it might be better to have multiple models, multiple choices and options, and there seemed to be at least some willingness once CARI gets further along to perhaps share some of their models and data to allow other communities to develop their own models. The third session was moderated by Bill Becker with Natural Capitalism Solutions. His background is not only on disasters but also on sustainability. And he led a discussion on national partnerships and how national partnerships apply to state and local. So there was a lot of discussion there about partnerships. The next person to speak was Wendy Freitag. She was supposed to cover state and local partnerships. But what she decided to do after the broad-ranging discussion that had occurred before her, to actually talk more about some general principles, which actually helped flesh out the discussion of what a disaster-resilient community is and what we need to do. Shirley Laska had the unenviable task of taking the morning session and actually talking about what are the gaps. At that point, she actually brought in something new to the equation, and in terms of risk map and the possibility of a partnership collaboration with FEMA that could assist us in promoting disaster resilient communities. And I would like Cindy to briefly talk